Hi, today I am going to explain a comedy short film, Alternative Math. The premise of the movie is set in a post-fact American society, where everything you say has to align with everyone else's opinion. In an elementary school, math teacher Mrs. Wells invites a student, Danny, to her class. Danny has failed his recent math test terribly, and is very mad about it. However, he isn't mad that he didn't do well on the test. Instead, he is bothered by the teacher who gave him bad grades and said all of his answers were wrong. Danny shows Mrs. Wells his answer sheet full of red markings and a big F on the top. The teacher calmly takes a look at his paper and explains that his answers are wrong. Seeing that the kid has written 2 plus 2 is equal to 22, it is clear that he is having some trouble with addition. Being the good teacher that she is, Mrs. Wells asks the boy to not be upset because it is normal for kids his age to be confused by numbers. She explains that he is here to learn and that making mistakes is a part of the learning experience. But by the look on Danny's face, her kind words went over his head. He expresses his confusion with a sassy nod to his teacher's face. Mrs. Wells remains composed and asks him to look at the questions again. She points out his obvious mistake, but Danny seems to be uninterested. Mrs. Wells further explains that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 22 because addition doesn't mean you can just put the numbers next to each other, you have to add them. As she explains how he can add the numbers, the kid scoffs and says that her method is stupid. The woman manages to suppress her frustration and tries giving him a practical example. She brings out 2 markers in each of her hands and puts them together, asking the kid how many markers she has in total. With all the sass he can gather, Danny replies that the answer is 22. Finally starting to get irritated, Mrs. Wells tells him he is wrong, and the obvious answer is 4. The spoiled kid pushes the box of markers off the desk and storms out of the classroom in anger. Mrs. Wells is left speechless by the kid's behavior, but she doesn't think much of it, until the very next day when his parents come to her classroom with a complaint. At first, they introduce themselves politely and take a seat at Mrs. Wells's request. Before the parents can voice their concerns, the teacher assures them that there is nothing to worry about. She further adds that it is completely normal for kids like Danny to get frustrated when they are struggling with a subject, especially a subject like math where they can hardly use their creativity. Danny's mother doesn't seem to be grateful for Mrs. Wells's kind words. She ignores everything the teacher says and asks why Danny is getting some answers wrong in her so-called test. Mrs. Wells is taken aback by the rudeness but doesn't show it in her face. She composes herself and starts explaining what kind of questions were on the test. After she states that Danny's answer to the question, "What is 2 plus 2" was 22, the room goes silent. One might think the parents realized that it was their son's mistake, but to Mrs. Wells's surprise, they ask her to go on, waiting for her to prove her point. It is clear that the couple doesn't understand that the kid's answer is wrong. The teacher bluntly says that 22 is not the right answer. The mother, in utter disbelief, asks Mrs. Wells, who says that the answer is wrong. Mrs. Wells replies that is how math works. The couple misses the whole point and accuses Mrs. Wells of calling their son stupid. The teacher explains that it was not her intention and that she is simply trying to correct his mistake. Things get heated when the dad starts to yell. He asks Mrs. Wells who she is to declare his son's answer is wrong and hers is right. Mrs. Wells is in complete shock at the stupidity of the couple. She tries to reason with them, stating that the answers are factual and they would never change. The mother acts like she understands Mrs. Wells's words, but then accuses her of being a Nazi and forcing absolute answers on her child. Confused by everything, the teacher bluntly asks the two if they know what 2 plus 2 equals. Instead of an answer, Mrs. Wells gets insults thrown at her. The father calls her a smart-ass tramp, then mocks her accent. Their politeness from a while ago vanishes in thin air as they get more and more aggressive. Still being respectful, Mrs. Wells tells them that she can no longer continue the conversation and shows them the way out. Danny's mother claims that they are going to complain to the principal, while his father shouts his son is a free thinker for saying the answer is 22. Before leaving, the mother threatens to get her kicked out of the job and calls her a bitch. Having had enough of the two, Mrs. Wells sarcastically shames them for not knowing what 2 plus 2 is. The scene abruptly ends as the mother slaps Mrs. Wells on her face. The following day, the principal comes to Mrs. Wells's class to discuss the matter. He immediately gets to the point and asks her what the issue was with Danny's parents. Mrs. Wells announces that it got a little crazy because the parents weren't cooperating. She inquires how the management is handling the situation, only to find out that they want her to apologize to the parents. This makes her even mad because the mother was the one who hit her. The principal has a problem with Mrs. Wells telling the kids that their answer is wrong. A confused Mrs. Wells says that it is her job as a teacher to tell them when they make mistakes. However, the principal doesn't share the same view. He claims that the teachers should not ram their biased views down the students' throats because the students have their own opinions. In the new and modernized world, everything has to be politically correct. It is wrong to declare a kid's answer incorrect because of your opinion. Mrs. Wells is left stunned. She claims that math cannot be biased because it is factual. The principal starts getting annoyed and says that Mrs. Wells's attitude is making the situation worse. He scornfully tells her that she is giving the children zero respect, which is against their school's policies. That day, a crowd of parents assembles in front of the school and protests against the teacher's absolute behavior. Mrs. Wells is shoved by the crowd, who asks her to stop undermining their kids' confidence. Some of them even demand her to apologize to the parents she offended by claiming that 2 + 2 is 4. Things get worse when they accuse her of hating children in general. Sensing the situation getting more serious, the school's superintendent and his council hold a meeting with Mrs. Wells. She nervously asks the board of men to wait for a week or two for the situation to blow over. But the superintendent claims they cannot wait because the parents are suing the school for emotional distress to a minor. Mrs. Wells exclaims that she only said 2 + 2 is 4, which shouldn't have caused this much trouble. The board members scoff at the comment and reply that she should admit the possibility of multiple correct answers to the same question. Mrs. Wells is in absolute disbelief. She knows that she is right, but the world seems to have changed to a weird place where every answer must be true and every fact is debatable. The principal accuses her of portraying everyone who disagrees with her as stupids. Mrs. Wells stays put in her opinion. The board members suspend her and ask her to reconsider her extremist views if she ever wants to get back to her job. The next day, Mrs. Wells packs up all her belongings from the school and returns home. At night, she watches the TV and finds out that the scandal has made the national television. Many political leaders are debating if 2 + 2 = 22 or 4. The media exaggerates the news and calls Mrs. Wells an activist who was caught abusing a kid's First Amendment rights. She is being called a liberal elitist for saying that 4 is the definite answer to the simple question. Some even belittle Mrs. Wells for not keeping the students in her class for more than a year, to which Mrs. Wells angrily says it's called graduating. While she is watching the news, annoyed at the stupidity of the reporters, she gets a call from the school. The principal informs her that she has officially been fired. He also asks her to come by the school the next day and requests her to stop radicalizing the students. The following day, Mrs. Wells goes to the school for the last time. As she walks through the entrance, she is greeted by a group of reporters patiently waiting for her. The school has invited them to prove they do not support Mrs. Wells's extremist view and to make it clear she is no longer their employee. Before officially signing the papers and ending her contract with the school, the principal says he will pay her the monthly salary for the last 2 terms. The salary rounds up to $2,000 for the last month and $2,000 for this one. The principal says that is $4,000 in total, but at last, Mrs. Wells claps back and claims it is actually $22,000. The movie ends as the principal awkwardly looks towards the reporters and back at a smiling Mrs. Wells. Subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.